Well, good morning to all of you. Thank you very much for coming to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We're delighted to have with us this morning, and we welcome to the center the Secretary of the United States Department of Interior, Gale Norton. Secretary Norton was nominated by President Bush and confirmed by the United States Senate in January 2001. As Secretary, she directs a department of 70,000 employees that manages 1 out of every 5 acres of land in the United States. The department's responsibilities range from managing our relations with American Indians to conserving land and wildlife to supplying water for the western United States. Secretary Norton characterizes her approach as the 4 C's: communication, consultation, and cooperation in the service of conservation. Thus, she has sought to build bridges between government and the communities, tribes, businesses, and individuals who live and work on public land. Secretary Norton began her very distinguished career as a senior attorney for the Mountain States Legal Foundation. She went on to work at the Department of Agriculture and as Associate Solicitor of the Department of the Interior, overseeing endangered species and public lands legal issues for the National Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. From 1991 to 1999, she served as Attorney General of Colorado. As Attorney General, she represented nearly every state agency, was a negotiator of the $206 billion national tobacco settlement, in the news this morning, incidentally, and at the time of her appointment in 2001, she was senior counsel at Brownstein, Hyatt, and Farber. Her talk today is entitled Freedom, a Power for Environmental Stewardship. Secretary Norton, we're delighted to have you here, and we welcome you to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all today. One of the things that is not in my official biography is that I spent a year at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and I think my activities there were much like those of the fellows here at the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and I found it to be one of the most stimulating, thought-provoking, and terrific years I've ever spent. And so I hope that for those of you who are here as part of the Wilson Institute, that you are enjoying that same sort of experience that I enjoyed at Hoover. Today I'll be talking about protecting the environment, but first let me amplify somewhat on what Lee Hamilton said about the Department of the Interior and our activities. As he mentioned, we have 1 out of every 5 acres of land in the United States that is part of our responsibility. The national parks and the wildlife refuges are the best known of those. We also manage the wide open spaces of the West, the multiple use lands of the Bureau of Land Management. If I can explain it the way that I often do to audiences, if Donald Trump owned as much land in the East as we own throughout the United States, he wouldn't own just a few hotels and casinos and office buildings. He would own the entire Eastern time zone. So we have a lot of responsibilities. We also provide water to 31 million people. About 60% of the produce on your grocery shelves is grown using Bureau of Reclamation water. We have the premier Earth Sciences Agency, involved in studying everything from volcanoes, earthquakes, and tsunamis to biology. From our lands and the offshore areas that we manage, we produce 1/3 of the nation's oil, natural gas, and coal. Our activities are as old as studying dinosaur fossils and ancient petroglyphs, and as futuristic as having our own satellite. We also look to the future through education. We're responsible for educating 50,000 Indian children through our Bureau of Indian Affairs schools every day. We have some of the best outdoor classrooms. In national parks, thousands of children learn about history and natural wonders through our Junior Ranger program. Our Take Pride in America volunteer program introduces kids to the joys and responsibilities of taking care of the natural world. Getting young people involved is just one aspect of developing the citizen stewardship that is at the heart of the Bush administration's approach to environmental protection. We call it cooperative conservation. Last summer, the President issued an executive order calling on the Interior and other federal agencies to expand this cooperative conservation approach. I would like to explain this subtle but profound development in environmental protection and how it is helping us improve the landscape. I'd like to take a few minutes to place this cooperative conservation in its context as a significant development in environmental protection. Let's begin by looking back to the early days of the conservation movement. 100 years ago, President Theodore Roosevelt saw that the fate of the natural world in the United States was at a critical juncture. People thought there was an inexhaustible supply of birds, like passenger pigeons. Historians record that in 1871, observers saw passenger pigeons nesting over a swath 75 miles long and 10 miles wide. But market hunters managed to decimate these populations. In 1875, hunters in Wisconsin sent more than 2 million pigeons to food markets. 40 years later, the last known passenger pigeon died in captivity in Cincinnati. President Roosevelt, himself an avid hunter, recognized the declining wildlife populations. By the time Theodore Roosevelt left office, 50 federal bird reserves had been established, along with 4 national game preserves. For the first few decades after Roosevelt's actions, the conservation movement focused on creation of parks and wildlife refuges and the management of game species like waterfowl and deer. Roosevelt's impetus to protect the environment by setting land aside yielded tremendous results. Today, the refuge system has grown to 95 million acres. Our national parks encompass another area of similar size. Wilderness areas total 100 million acres, an area as large as the state of California. Over time, the conservation ethic evolved and expanded. By the late 1940s, Aldo Leopold, a forester by training, was calling for a more ambitious conservation agenda. He published the Sand County Almanac, which provided the framework for a new approach to natural resource management, one based on managing our lands as a whole rather than as individual parts. At the heart of Leopold's conservation ethic was a call to all citizens to take responsibility and become stewards of the land. Over the last 35 years of the 20th century, however, we entered another phase of environmental protection. Problems with the environment were dramatically visible. The nation's symbol, the bald eagle, was on the verge of extinction. The Cuyahoga River was on fire, and smokestacks belched fumes into our cities. Out of this crisis period came the enactment of landmark environmental laws, ranging from the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act to the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act. Compliance with these laws and others has significantly improved our environment. Just think what Los Angeles air quality would look like without the Clean Air Act. But there's been controversy along the way. Federal policies resulted in conflicts, real and perceived, between economic growth and environmental protection. Environmental discussions triggered passionate antagonism and hostility. In political and media debates, environmentalists and businesses demonized each other. We've learned that command and control approaches have their strengths and their limitations. The Endangered Species Act provides an example. The Act gives us an important tool to punish and prevent the wanton killing of birds and animals that caused the extinction of species like the passenger pigeon. But the Act's punitive aspects intimidate otherwise law-abiding citizens into fearing endangered species. I was at a town meeting in South Dakota where we had ranchers come in who were concerned about the possibility that prairie dogs might be listed on the endangered species list. They told me that when the proposal first surfaced about doing that, the sale of prairie dog poison doubled. Now, that's clearly not the kind of incentive we want to have for endangered species. But even this morning, even before speaking with your group today, I had a group of women in agriculture from across the country in my office talking about endangered species. I talked to them about some of the things that we're doing to try and encourage people to welcome endangered species to their land. And they still looked a little incredulous at the idea of why someone would want to attract an endangered species. Command and control methods, we have learned, enforce minimum standards of behavior. In my prior life, I was Attorney General of Colorado. I prosecuted people criminally for midnight dumping of hazardous chemicals. Unfortunately, there are still people who will put drums of hazardous chemicals next to elementary schools, or who would thumb their noses at pollution controls. For these people, we need criminal enforcement. But thankfully today, the vast majority of Americans tremendously enjoy a clean and healthy environment. In this new 21st century, Americans are enthusiastic about having both a thriving economy and a spectacular natural world. The environmental challenges we face in the 21st century are in many ways more subtle and more difficult than those we have tackled in the past. They deal with managing increasing demands on the land and conservation of our resources. How do we meet the need to develop and expand our economy while conserving our land and its rivers, plains, forests, and abundant wildlife? Enforcing minimum standards alone will not achieve the level of environmental quality that we want to see. We need to go beyond minimum compliance and reach out to harness innovation and enthusiasm. We need to tap into American ingenuity and community spirit to care for our land, water, air, and wildlife. This is where freedom clearly benefits the environment. Today we are here at the Woodrow Wilson Center within the Ronald Reagan building. Both presidents believed in the power of freedom. Both saw America as a force for good. Though these great men have stepped into the twilight of memory, freedom is still on the march. America is still facing awesome challenges as a nation. Yet we sometimes underestimate the strength of freedom to solve those problems. Today, we often think of freedom in terms of foreign policy. Freedom is also essential here at home in ways we seldom consider. Freedom creates an atmosphere allowing environmental stewardship. Coupled with private property rights and respect for the rule of law, freedom creates a power for environmental stewardship that cannot be underestimated. The namesake of this organization once noted, "I believe in democracy because it releases the energies of every human being." That idea is at the heart of the administration's approach to environmental policy. Over the next several minutes, I'm going to describe a few of the ways in which we are unleashing that energy to generate environmental stewardship and economic prosperity. Freedom works. How do we know? Take a look around the globe. The lands are greener where freedom flourishes. The lands are cleaner where the rule of law governs. For the most part, free people share the same environmental values, even if they sometimes disagree on the best methods and most effective solutions. For one thing, free people usually generate the wealth and commit the resources needed to care for the environment. The converse is also true. Despotism leads to environmental destruction. When the Iron Curtain fell, it revealed almost unimaginable environmental contamination. I had the opportunity to visit the Soviet Union in 1981. I was on a bus with a number of other people from the American Bar Association group that I was with. And we came over a hill into a beautiful little valley in an area near Sochi. And we saw in the middle of this valley a smokestack, and it was just putting out this black smoke all across the valley. And so we asked our Soviet in-tourist guide, the people that are there to make sure that tourists get the proper message, and said, "So what about environmental problems in the Soviet Union? How do you deal with those?" And her answer was, We have no environmental problems in the Soviet Union. Well, that is clearly not the way to get your problems resolved. Tyranny leads to environmental errors. One of Saddam Hussein's well-known events was torching the oil fields in Kuwait. We also know that he drained the vast wetlands in southern Iraq. Those wetlands were once the largest in the Middle East, twice the size of the Florida Everglades. Under Saddam, they shrank into a shadow, with little but scrub brush and salty earth, displacing people who had lived there for generations. Freedom can restore the corruption created by tyranny. Freedom has reopened the gates to Iraq's wetlands. My department is working with the Army Corps of Engineers and the U.S. Agency for International Development to reconstruct those marshlands. Fruits of that renewal can already be seen. The President and I are working to channel the power of freedom at home, too. The core of this administration's environmental approach is the conviction that conservation comes best through willing hands and willing hearts. Cooperative conservation, as I mentioned, is the touchstone of our efforts at the Interior Department. Through cooperative conservation, we are encouraging partnerships with all who are willing to help, conservation groups and large companies, private landowners, and nonprofits. We want results. We want innovative approaches and long-lasting solutions. We want local people to be involved in conservation decisions. They often know the land best, and they often benefit most from its care. Those benefits are far more than monetary. They are cleaner air and cleaner water, healthy parks, and thriving refuges. As local communities become greener, the entire nation benefits. Let me share with you an example of cooperative conservation. Last month, I was with a group of scientists who were very excited about a dramatic announcement. They had rediscovered the ivory-billed woodpecker. This bird is a spectacular black and white creature with a crimson head crest. It was believed to have gone extinct decades ago. Instead, it was rediscovered. That gave us the gift of a second chance, and we plan to use it. To make the recovery efforts as effective as possible, we're going to take a cooperative approach. And we could have started with a heavy-handed approach, telling local landowners that they would be prohibited from doing a whole laundry list of activities on their property. But that would have instantly alienated hundreds of local citizens whose support is critical for the bird's survival. It only takes one idiot to forever destroy that bird and its chances of survival. Instead, we're reaching out to willing hands. We're working closely with the Nature Conservancy and the Department of Agriculture on acquiring easements from willing sellers. We're enrolling farmers in the Conservation Reserve Program and buying land to expand our wildlife refuges. We held town hall meetings near the site where the bird was spotted a few weeks ago, and the local citizens are enthusiastic. Having tools to encourage voluntary conservation gives us more tools in our toolbox for achieving conservation success. That cooperative effort extends to funding. Private sector groups and citizens have already committed $10 million toward research and habitat protection efforts for the woodpecker. We at the Interior Department, together with the Agriculture Department, have proposed spending $10 million in federal funds to protect the bird and its habitat. It's still early, but I believe the cooperative conservation approach will make a big difference for recovering the woodpecker. Cooperative approaches are making a great difference in this country and around the world. The power of cooperative conservation is the reason that this administration has sent $1.7 billion in grants to states, cities, tribes, conservation groups, farmers and ranchers, and other partners for on-the-ground conservation projects. Wetlands are being restored through these cooperative conservation grants. Invasive species are being eradicated. Native vegetation is being replanted, and the environment is being enhanced. We are also helping spread the word about how cooperative efforts can solve local environmental problems. In the President's executive order, he called for a White House conference, which will be held in late August, to highlight successful approaches for cooperative conservation. The role of freedom is somewhat different when we discuss issues like in energy production. Regulation obviously has a place. But by creating an atmosphere where technological innovation can flourish, we gain tools that better protect the environment. Let me give you an example from a controversial subject, and that is the administration's proposal for opening the Anwar area on the North Slope of Alaska to energy production. We've seen in the North Slope that older technologies and the older approaches that were not as careful about the environment have indeed caused a sprawl of oil development. But today we know that we can accomplish those energy production goals while at the same time protecting the environment. I've visited the North Slope of Alaska 3 times now and seen how that new technology can be used. And one of the new facilities, it's more like visiting what you would envision as a colony on the moon. Everything is self-contained in a very small space. There are not any permanent roads to that facility. It uses only ice roads that melt away when the springtime comes in order to transport materials. The exploration is done entirely on ice pads that likewise melt away when the springtime comes and leave virtually no trace. We are able to require the companies to use directional drilling so that they can reach from one small space on the surface to large areas underground. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, the comparison would be if you had drilling pads at the site of the Capitol, you could reach anywhere within the District of Columbia underground with no impact on the surface. That's the kind of innovation that allows us to have a legitimate debate about how we can protect the environment at the same time we produce energy. And both houses of Congress have now voted in support of that proposal, and we anticipate moving forward with it as energy legislation and budget legislation move ahead. The President has a 3-part policy for energy in this country. That includes, first of all, conservation, and certainly that's an area where we need to have innovation. And secondly is renewables. We in the Department of the Interior have been working on renewable energy production for geothermal energy, for example. During the last 4 years in office, the previous administration approved 20 geothermal leases. In our first 4 years, we've approved 10 times that number, 200 geothermal leases. On wind energy, between 1996 and 2000, the previous administration approved 6 wind energy permits. Between 2000 and 2004, we permitted 10 times that number. In addition to those 60 wind energy permits, approval is pending on 46 permits for wind energy rights-of-way. We've even ordered agency land use planners to consider the development of renewable energy sources when examining land use plans. But renewable sources will not be sufficient to meet the nation's energy needs in the short term. We need traditional sources too. We also need more nuclear plants and more technological development for new forms of oil and natural gas, like oil shale and methane hydrates. As we think about energy, we need to consider the international picture. It has become very clear to us that the United States is no longer the dominant and only player in world oil markets. Global competition for energy is growing dramatically as the economies of India and China expand. I saw a study, or a chart that was in a study that was done by Goldman Sachs, talking about the expansion of the Chinese economy. And that chart predicted that the Chinese gross domestic product would surpass that of the United States in 2041. We know that the United States has been rapidly losing some of its industrial base because of the high cost of energy in this country. Natural gas is a North American market, not an international market. And because of that, we see tremendous price differentials around the world. In the United States, natural gas costs about 10 times as much as it does in some other parts of the world. Consequently, we've lost 90,000 jobs in the chemical industry over the past 5 years, much of that attributable to the lower costs of natural gas in the places where they are relocating. Chemicals used to be a major export of the United States just a few years ago. And today we see that China is building 50 new chemical facilities over $1 billion. Well, the United States only has one under construction. China is reaching out to acquire the energy it needs. For example, last fall, China signed an oil and gas agreement with Iran worth at least $70 billion. They've become closer with Venezuela. They're reaching out to African nations for long-term supplies of oil and natural gas. China's increased consumption is one of the reasons that we've seen almost shocking energy prices. But we can prepare ourselves against energy shocks. We need to look at developing America's domestic energy supplies. If we go back to ANWR, that is our largest untapped onshore reserve of energy in this country. Senator Domenici estimated that ANWR, at its production capabilities, full production, would provide about $18 billion a year benefit to the U.S. balance of trade compared with buying that same energy elsewhere. And that means that over the lifetime of the project, it could provide $500 billion benefit to the U.S. balance of trade. Through freedom, innovation, cooperation, and local problem solving, we can build a nation in which economic prosperity and environmental protections go hand in hand. A nation in which ivory-billed woodpeckers can continue to recover. A nation in which future generations enjoy our spectacular natural outdoors. It can happen. Cooperative conservation gives us the tools. Energy security provides the power. And freedom confers the foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. We'll open it up for a few questions. We appreciate your comments. Jeff, we'll begin with you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Norton, for the presentation. Two questions, in fact. One, could you tell us how you and the department are viewing the effort to try to assign values to particularly some of these environmental services that you talked about that are more difficult to put a dollar value on, but in a sense the value of various ecosystems and what they mean for clean air and environmental health and that category, as finding additional ways to make arguments to folks who might have a initial reaction of resistance to, say, endangered species argument when these larger values can be put on the table in a broader basket of benefits. So that would be the first question, the kind of assigning financial value to some of these services. The second one would be is an ANWR question, and is asking
why don't I answer the first question and then come back to the second question, because I'll forget one or the other of the questions. On that, there are both some pluses and some minuses. It's a complex issue. First of all, with contingent valuation methodologies, I'm familiar with that from the natural resource damage perspective in Superfund cleanups. There are some real problems because one of the ways in which those are computed is essentially to go out and do a public opinion survey and say, how much would you pay to have this area near your community be restored to its natural conditions? And people say, well, I'd pay $10. So you multiply that $10 times the million people who live in the vicinity, and you say $10 million. Now that's very simplified, I know, but you've got some problems with valuing things in that kind of a way. On the other hand, I think, and so I do have some concerns about that approach. We in the department have put in place an appraisal process that, for the most part, it relies on standard appraisal valuation approaches, not using that type of an approach. But we do have the possibility of using that as a way of presenting information in addition to appraisals, as long as we're clear about what the methodology is. On the other hand, I think it is very important to try to examine market mechanisms that do provide actual value for those kinds of things. One of the examples of that is in the fees that people pay for use of outdoor areas. We are working on a recreation fee project, and it has been in place as a demonstration project so that the money that goes from the fees you pay at when you go into a park, those used to just go into the black hole of the federal treasury. And now, under this demonstration project, they started staying with the local parks and being used for projects at those parks. And that has now been extended to be a permanent program at our wildlife refuges and other appropriate public lands areas. We really encourage our managers to use that money in a way that shows the visitors the benefits for what they've paid. We think it makes a lot of sense to have that kind of incentive approach and market transaction approach so that as people use our outdoor areas more, they're also paying the costs of that. Instead of that being entirely run through Washington, so the only time you get funding for those kinds of small projects is when conditions get so bad it gets to the attention of Congress to get the issues resolved. And so we think that is appropriate. There are a lot of other examples, like emissions trading in the air quality perspective, where you, in essence, create a market in the tradable emissions credits that allow the market forces to come into effect and have a real market that demonstrates the economic value of that. And I think those are very successful approaches. In fact, that's what I spent my year at Hoover Institution researching, was emissions trading. Okay. Anwar.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. I will take the opportunity to ask a second question about Anwar. And it's asking you, how do you respond to the argument when folks say they absolutely agree that that energy reserve is critically important, and they say that they see the development with Chinese searching for energy and rising Chinese energy needs being critically important, but then turn around and say because of those factors, that oil is so important that we should wait as long as we can to drill it and keep it in reserve as in some sense a strategic petroleum reserve in the ground, and get it from abroad while we can, and then when those sources become more scarce, then we still have this fallback plan.
Hopefully, decades from now, we will not be relying on just our traditional sources of energy. Hopefully we will have much more renewable energy available. We also see developments like oil shale. Now, I'm from Colorado. A few decades ago, we had a big push to develop oil shale resources. And in Colorado, when you talk about oil shale, it's sort of like, in New York saying, well, we've got a Brooklyn Bridge that's for sale. People became very suspicious about oil shale. There are now companies that are getting back into viewing that as a serious possibility. The oil shale reserves of the United States, which are largely found in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, are estimated to be 1.5 trillion barrels. Now, that compares to the world oil resource at 3 trillion barrels. And so the United States, within that resource, has 50% of the world oil resources. And so if that technology is developed in a way that it can be produced in an environmentally responsible way and an economically viable way, then that gives us considerably more energy security than the 10 billion barrels at ANWR being held in reserve. But 10 billion barrels today is a very, very significant resource. Similarly, methane hydrates are another new technology kind of possibility. These are essentially frozen, it's essentially frozen natural gas. It's found in the Arctic and in the deep areas of the ocean. And it has, up to now, been more of a hazard than a valuable commodity, because it has the little problem when you bring it up and take it out of being in a cold and very high pressure area, it expands and explodes. And so it is not something that we are yet able to develop, but the resources of natural gas in the frozen form are, in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, estimated to be 100,000 times as much as our traditional natural gas resource. And so in the long-term future, on even the traditional types of energy, oil and natural gas, we have capabilities for technological development, but those are still a few decades in the future before those would become available.
Thank you, Rob, and then John.
Robert Litvak at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Secretary Norton. For most Americans, one of the most visible dimensions of your department's activities is the park system. And could you discuss in a little more detail sort of how you see the current status of the park system? Has unprecedented demand for services. The infrastructure is being taxed. With respect to financing, do Americans view this as sort of a free service that they expect the government to provide, or do you view some user fees of people taking advantage of the parks as contributing to maintenance of infrastructure and perhaps expanding the system to take into account the high demand that exists for those activities?
Well, people do love our national parks. And I've had the unusual experience that I doubt almost any other federal official has had, of people saying, gee, you don't charge enough for the national parks. You know, how many other government services do we say that? It costs, you can get a pass that will give you admission to all national parks for a year for $50. And so it is, and that's what it takes for one day on a ski slope, pursuing one of my favorite activities. And so you see that there is a lot more potential, I think, for people to pay for those. We need to make sure, though, that people continue to feel like they are getting their appropriate money's worth, and we don't price them to the high prices we might be able to charge. We do want to be sure that our national parks are always available to everyone. We have invested and are today spending more per acre, per employee, and per visitor than ever before in the history of our national parks. And we have invested a tremendous amount. The President's commitment was $4.9 billion over 5 years in maintenance and sprucing up our national parks. And so we have underway or completed 4,000 projects across the country at our national parks. One part of your question, though, is not as true as you might expect, and that is the increase in visitation. Our national park visitation has increased by about 20% over the last 20 years. It has not been a dramatic increase. Where we've seen a dramatic increase has been in our wildlife refuges, which are located within an hour of every major city. People are beginning to realize that they're great places for bird watching or for hiking or introducing kids to nature. And we see more active recreation. People want to do extreme sports. They want to be out doing very intensive activities on our public lands. And that is usually on our Bureau of Land Management lands. For example, we've got a lot of mountain biking activity around Moab, Utah. And our visits to the Bureau of Land Management lands have gone up by 80% over that time period. And so we view our responsibility as providing recreational activities as well as environmental protection activities for a wide variety of different kinds of outdoor activities. And so we try to provide that whole variety of different things. But the area that it has not gotten the attention because people don't think of it is in our BLM lands.
Did I understand, if I go into Yosemite or Yellowstone and I pay a fee as I go in, is that money used in that park, or basically, or how do you distribute that money?
We have a formula where 80% of it stays with that park, and then 20% goes into a pool, because a number of our parks don't charge entrance fees, but this gives them an opportunity to share in some of that revenue as well.
John?
Thank you, Secretary Norton. First, let me just say how much I appreciate the park system, and I really think it's wonderful. Thank you for sustaining that. My question is hopefully not too theoretical, but just to put in context some of your speech, what's the current scientific assessment sort of on the state of environmental degradation in this country, and is there a baseline that the administration works towards for environmental sustainability that they use as a focus for generating policy?
We've been working on development of environmental indicators and getting more ability to be able to say what direction the environment is going. We are part of an international operation that's taking place that, and I forget the acronym for it, but it's basically using more satellite monitoring and common monitoring of resources around the world, so we've got a better understanding of global trends. But overall, the air has been getting progressively cleaner over the last 30 years. The water has been getting cleaner. We have more acres of wetlands that, our entire trend on wetlands has changed from when we were trying to move away from rapid loss of wetlands and conversion into other uses to today. We're now, the President has set the goal, and we're launching, moving toward an increase in wetlands. And our forested areas are more than they have been, more than they were in 1900, for example. And so we see some very good trends in environmental protection and in the state of our environment over time. People tend to lose track of that, but we do see a lot of progress. We want to see more, obviously. And there are in many ways, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. And when you talk about air pollution, it's fairly easy to get that first cleanup and the first increment of cleanup. It becomes increasingly more technologically challenging to get more and more cleanup. Considering how much our economy has expanded and how many more people we have today, for our air to be cleaner is really quite an accomplishment for this country.
Okay, well, we got two more questions, and that'll have to be all. We'll go here and then over there.
Thank you for your exposition on cooperative environmental management. Cooperative cooperative
Conservation.
conservation. I've been following the Anwar story fairly closely in the papers, and I stumble a little bit in my understanding of how that cooperative conservation principle is being applied to the Anwar situation. Obviously, there's been a pretty intense political struggle over the question of exploiting the refuge for many years, and that suggests that there's a large and committed constituency opposed to that exploitation. So that in reaching out to one set of willing hands, the administration rather gives the appearance of bulldozing another set of unwilling hands. And the contrast is the more striking when there appears to be a reasonable and viable alternative measure, a conservation measure, which would be a modest increase in gas mileage requirements for motor vehicles, which would achieve, if not exceed, both the trade balance results and the energy security results that you cited with respect to Anwar exploitation. Thank you very much.
First of all, we have, as part of our cooperative conservation approach, we do want to listen to people in local communities. And I've met with the residents of Kaktovik, who are the ones that actually live in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I've met with others in the area. I've met with people who oppose the Anwar drilling from Alaska. The vast majority of Alaskans support it. And so looking and including the vast majority of residents in Kaktovik. And so I think that listening to local perspectives is part of what we in this administration believe in. You know, we've also, with offshore energy, taken the perspective of listening to the states that are on the coast. And so the president supports the moratoria on the basis of the perspectives of the local states and the neighboring states. From the perspective of looking at, do you do CAFE and the congressional proposal on the fleet economy of gas mileage versus do you do Anwar? People look at that as a choice of either or. What you don't take into account is that our overall production of fuel-adjusted oil, our oil in this country is declining because as you tap an existing source of oil, that reservoir is eventually depleted. And the United States domestic production has onshore certainly been going down. We've seen some increases from the deep water areas of the Gulf of Mexico. But overall, just to stay even, we need to have Anwar production and to begin to meet our growing demand. And so just the amount that you would get from the proposals on CAFE don't begin to change that decline in production and our increasing need. And so we really need to look at conservation from the automobile mileage perspective. When the administration has supported the tax credits for hybrid vehicles. We've just extended that to clean diesel vehicles. We've looked at other approaches, including the development of the hydrogen-fueled vehicles, the hydrogen fuel cells, which gets us entirely away from gasoline as the source of fueling our automobiles. So, and this administration has really made that a priority. And so there are a lot of things that we are doing that don't get into the safety versus gas mileage trade-off that the CAFE issue raises.
Okay, we'll have to conclude over here with this question.
Yes, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to make this, it's a straight legal question. What do you think of some of the cases that have come up? I think the last one is and they seem very strange, it came up out of the Ninth Circuit, where various species, where different organizations are putting various species up in their own right to get the species standing under the Endangered Species Act. Meaning, for example, there was one the coho salmon standing alone. In other words, no other organization with it versus ABC. In other words, there's a real movement in some portions of the community to get species in their own right standing. I just wondered what your views are on that issue, but standing specifically under the Endangered Species Act.
I have not seen those cases specifically, so this is commenting, okay, this is commenting somewhat in the abstract on that. We do see a lot of litigation under the Endangered Species Act where they are trying to get us to take particular actions as to a particular species, which is different than the standing issue. And those, that the Act allows for that litigation. We, and this has been true of Department of the Interior, both in this administration and the previous administration, don't feel that that litigation is the most productive way of using our resources. We'd rather work on endangered species recovery. I have some real concerns about that issue in the abstract. It's hard to say who actually speaks for a species. Is it the fishermen? Is it the tribes who may have a long-standing cultural and religious tradition? Is it a biologist? There are lots of different aspects of that, and I think a court really, by trying to read the mind of what a species wants, is treading in some strange territory.
Let's express our thanks to Secretary Norton for a very good presentation. Would you remain seated while she goes out, please, so she can get on the way? Thank you very, very much.